Following on from the project's big picture fiasco last week, which was somewhat unusually unanimously voted down by every single Premier League club, and I say unusually since one of them basically wrote it with the help of another one, this week it was the turn of the European Premier League. If they manage to maintain this level of consistency, I'll throw away my diary and calendars and instead just track the passage of time by the latest tantrum to be thrown by the Premier League's big boys. The new plans, coming under the name of a European Premier League, really aren't that new at all. There's been talk of some kind of European Super League for as long as I can remember, so there's not much intrigue to be had there. I can remember my dad telling me there'd be a European Super League at some stage on the drive home from Portman Road when I was 14 or 15 years old, and I spent the next 2 hours grilling him on how it would work, who'd be in it, and whether or not it would operate with a system of promotion and relegation. It's a long old drive from Ipswich to East Yorkshire, and once you've spent 20 minutes talking about Jay Simpson's impressive finish by the back of his head, you have to find a new way to pass the time. He was hopelessly ill-prepared for the cross-examination, but his fundamental thesis may well prove to have been correct. So the idea of a European Premier League is nothing new, but of course, the details are. This is not, as has long been posited, a replacement for Europe's domestic top flights, but really more of an alternative to the Champions League. That would be particularly bad news for UEFA, since the Champions League is the organisation's primary cash cow. It's for that reason that the tournament has become so bloated over the years, and why they have been planning to make it even more cumbersome and milk it even further over the next few years. During last season's unusual Champions League knockout stages held in Portugal, many supporters voiced their appreciation and support for the straight one-legged knockout tie system, rather than all games other than the final being played across 2 legs. The games were fast, frantic, and unburdened by the prospect of away goals having an increased weighting. What's more, a tie being played out across 90 rather than 180 minutes throws up a greater chance of upset and shocks, as we saw with Lyon dumping out Man City, Leipzig causing an upset against Atletico Madrid, and obviously Bayern Munich's total annihilation of a Barcelona team that was all at sea. Of course, the fact that supporters enjoyed it makes absolutely no bones to the bigwigs at UEFA. Fewer games means less cash, and as such, any reduction in the number of games played is out of the question. It's the same reason why the proposed European Premier League would adopt a league rather than a knockout format, why the Premier League's top 6 want a longer pre-season to play in lucrative pre-season friendlies and competitions, and why one day the World Cup will most likely be comprised of about 88 national teams, with group stages ending in 17-0 scorelines, and qualification to what was once football's most prestigious competition no longer seeming quite so special. UEFA weren't the only ones to voice their displeasure about the proposals though. There were some people who didn't even have any financial incentive or potential loss of future earnings who were critical as well. Just as was the case with Project Big Picture, probably in excess of 90% of fans, ex-players, and key press figures were critical of the proposals, and their initial backlash is understandable. I think the natural gut reaction to such an idea is to reject it, but just take a look at some of the most frequent arguments made against a European Premier League. The primary issues appear to be that it would destroy free competition, create a league that was motivated almost entirely by finances, and open up an enormous disconnect between the elite domestic clubs and the lower league teams. But just stop and take a look. Isn't that where we are already at right now? In terms of competition, the Premier League already has a very rigid top 4 or top 6, which only allows for a small amount of interchange each season, and those fresh faces who do break in every now and then, whether it's Newcastle United or Southampton, tend not to stick around for long, as normal order is usually rather rapidly resumed. When it comes to creating a league motivated by finances, I think we already see that throughout the Premier League. Premier League teams paid out a record £263.3 million in agents' fees alone across the 2019-20 season, a figure which will no doubt be even higher this season despite a pandemic and government response, which has crippled the UK economy, which will leave many football fans and members of the wider public unemployed, underemployed, or fearful about their future. And as for a disconnect between the top and bottom clubs, we already live in a world where Premier League owners have a combined net worth in excess of $100 billion. Meanwhile, around half of all League 1 and 2 teams are staring down the barrel of extinction, vast swathes of the non-league game appear to be fundamentally unviable, and there are championship teams laden with more debt than the Greek government, gambling money that they don't have in the hope of unlocking the untold riches of the Premier League. The truth, I'm sad to say, is that the future that many pundits, journalists and fans fear is already a reality. We just don't want to believe it yet and have been sucked into Sky Sports' best league in the world marketing ploy. All the while, competition has been eroded, plenty of men in suits have got very rich, and there has never been a greater disconnect between the man on the street and the players out on the pitch. I do not want to sound like some nostalgic old dinosaur yearning for a bygone era. I'm not a sentimental person, and the Premier League was created before I was even born. Times move on, and it would be madness to think otherwise. But it doesn't have to be this way, and not all change is progress. It used to be the case that English football had a real Football League pyramid. Every 4th division team knew they were only a few good decisions away from the top flight, and once you were there, well, anything could happen. The Football League was truly wide open. The financial gulf between the divisions was minimal, based upon little more than game receipts. If you could develop a star player and get fans through the door, well then typically you could keep hold of that player for a number of years, invest that money in strengthening your squad, and the sky would be the limit. Nowadays, the difference between League 2 and the Premier League is like the difference between a cleaner and the chief executive at a FTSE 100 corporation. There is just no comparison. When the Premier League was founded, the slogan was that this would be, quote, a whole new ballgame. Well, it's practically ended up being a whole new sport. If a League 2 club develops a great player now, they might lose them for peanuts before they have even registered their league debut. So extensive is the top team's hoovering up of talent even amongst the youth ranks. Without wanting to get political or too deep, the increasing inequality that we've seen in football, particularly since the early 1990s, is one that is reflective of our wider society over the same period. Social mobility in the richest countries increased dramatically for a number of decades prior to the 1980s, but since 1990 it has stalled, and the gap between rich and poor has begun to widen significantly. In this sense, there's nothing unusual about football. What we have seen in recent decades, the monopolising of trophies among the top teams and of domestic football's finances by the Premier League, the constant struggle of those further down the pyramid just to exist, and the insatiable lust for further financial reward among the already extremely rich is not unique to football. We have seen it in almost every industry. The problem is that we don't like to think of football as being just another industry. It has a certain level of emotional attachment and heritage that is unlike almost any other business. To some, this makes football sacred, but unfortunately, most of those people are not actually in positions of authority and are not those calling the shots within the sport. It's for that reason that I am not totally opposed to the idea of a European Premier League, although only in the right circumstances. One suspects that the idea of the European Premier League replacing the Champions League is likely to be viewed as a trial period by the top clubs. That way they can reduce their reliance on their domestic leagues, thus strengthening their hand in negotiations on that front, whilst also assessing the success of the European League and whether it could replace the domestic league altogether. For that reason, I wouldn't allow any teams to compete in both the Premier League and the European Premier League. They can't have it both ways. If teams want to break away from the domestic Football League pyramid, then so be it, but there can be no half measures. My suspicion is that a proper European Super League that did replace a domestic league would be fraught with problems. Games between European giants are a welcome accompaniment to the normal league system now, but as a replacement for them, in an instant, you lose the joy of giant killings, of genuine contrasting styles of play, and of many local derbies. Liverpool versus Bayern Munich may seem great, but how would most Liverpool fans who have supported the club for generations and live in Merseyside feel about losing the Merseyside derby? Or Juventus fans about losing their rivalry with Torino? Oftentimes, these are the games that made fans fall in love with football. I read Martin Samuel's column in the Mail in which he shared a similar sentiment about the pitfalls of a European Premier League. Samuel is more sure than I could ever be with regards to the lack of interest in such a competition. Ultimately, if you have Juventus facing Barcelona, with the two most famous footballers on the planet facing each other, people are going to tune in. But star names do not guarantee success. I'm fairly certain that a large number of fans of the breakaway teams, if this were ever to happen, would boycott out of principle and try to find new teams as emotionally testing as that may be. Of those willing to go along for the ride, they may well find that the same teams playing each other every season isn't quite as enthralling as they had hoped. In an ideal world, I'd like to see the European Premier League set up a prohibitively expensive pay-per-view system that struck a serious blow to the league support. Already I think the recent £14.95 experiment has awoken an anger in supporters, some of whom have discovered for the first time that they can have an actual day out and watch their local team live, for less with a couple of mates, and enjoy a wholly more fulfilling experience. When Liverpool are playing PSG for a third consecutive season, meanwhile England's top flight has been handed a new lease of life and a degree of competition not seen since the 1970s, maybe some fans will decide a trip to their local non-league, lower league, or at least existing domestic league is really more of an enjoyable experience. So a European Premier League would create further financial division in football, it would further destroy competition, and create an even greater disconnect between the top and the bottom of the sport. But ultimately, I suspect, it would crash and burn. If or when that were to happen, none of the Super League teams should be allowed to waltz back into the upper echelons of the English game. They will have made their bed, and they can start again in tiers 8 or 9. Of course, this may well just be posturing on the part of Europe's biggest clubs in order to collectively extract more money from their domestic leagues. The fact that it supposedly has the backing of FIFA though, and that JP Morgan seemed to have been consulted with regards to providing a debt package of $6 billion, suggests that there has been some degree of seriousness to such discussions. Perhaps I am being utopian, but English football is broken, and I don't believe there are enough well-intentioned people in senior enough roles with the will to change that fact for anything substantial to happen anytime soon. Consequently, the only chance we have of fixing the sport may be for things to get worse before they can get better, and for some chaos to give birth to a dancing star and a more vibrant, competitive, and equal football league pyramid. We know it can be done, since that is what we had for more than 100 years. I should add that there were a myriad of problems that faced English football prior to the creation of the Premier League and the flooding of wealth into the sport, from stadium disasters that claimed hundreds of lives to the retain and transfer system which essentially subjected footballers to modern-day serfdom. I am certainly not advocating for a return to those days, but there is no reason why we can't have safe stadia, full employment rights for players, and a league system in which every team can harbour hopes and dreams of succeeding, and no one has an innate right to compete in any legal competition or to wield unjustifiable control over others. It is an old adage in business that once you forget about the customer or consumer that your business was designed to cater for, you are doomed to failure. So many of the recent proposals coming down from the top end of football seem to bear so little consideration for the fans that it beggars belief. The continued support and viewership of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people worldwide, is just taken for granted. The assumption seems to be that those fans cannot go anywhere else, and that it is simply a question of extracting the most wealth out of each and every one of them as is physically possible. But they can go elsewhere. There will always be other leagues, other sports, and other forms of entertainment. Premier League football teams can function without fans in the ground, as we have seen over the last few months, but they cannot function without fans altogether. Anyhow, that is just my take on the situation, and no doubt some of you agree and some of you disagree, so I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down below in the comments. Thank you as ever for watching, hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, it is much appreciated, subscribe to HITC Sevens if you'd like to see more videos from the channel in the future, and feel free to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, where the username is simply @HITC Sevens on both.